So, hello everyone, once again to the What We Are Reading YouTube channel of the South American Mycorrhizal Research Network. Today marks our 50th interview after 7 years of this YouTube channel. And because mycorrhizas are so complex and so diverse and they require uh, so different fields of study, today our interview is a little bit different and we are going to focus more on the plant side of the symbiosis. And for that, we have today André Parise. He's a PhD candidate from the University of Reading in the UK. And he, together with Michael Marder, brought a really nice recent article called Extended Plant Cognition, a critical consideration of the concept in theoretical and experimental plant physiology. You will find the link below for this article. And he has written several more articles about this, and he's participating in different kinds of conferences, in mycorrhizal conferences, in psychology conferences, because indeed it's a very broad concept. So let me start by asking you what in your life or in your career led you to study this particular topic, which I think that you will agree that some people might find controversial or difficult.
Yeah, definitely it's controversial. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this interview and for the opportunity to share a bit of my research. So I think this started as an interdisciplinary exploration of this field from the beginning, because when I was an undergrad in Brazil, I studied biology, and I was part of a study group on evolution, where we would meet every week to discuss papers and different theories of evolution, etc. And we had a chat group as well. So when I left the university after graduating and I moved to do my master's to another city, I was still in this group. And one day someone sent a link of a journal, of a magazine article about this research on extended cognition in spiders, citing this paper that I always cite, that suggested or proposed that spiders are extended their cognition to the webs. And I found it fascinating as a reading. And while I was reading this, I realized immediately that plants could potentially be doing the same, because like spiders, plants modify the environment in so many ways to ensure their survival. And that's where it all started. Then I talked, of course, to my supervisor, Professor Gustavo Souza. He liked the idea. He thought it was very reasonable. Then I had the opportunity to discuss this with Monica Galliano, which is an important plant cognition scientist. She also liked the idea, and then we wrote this first paper together in 2020, proposing the idea. And that's how it all started.
Okay, that's that's very nice. And in this more recent article, you start by talking about philosophy of mind, and you present, like, introduce the body mind separation, or the body mind problem. Can you explain us a little bit what that means and where it started?
Yeah, this paper we published this year with Michael Marder has a more philosophical approach, because Michael is a philosopher. And philosophy is very important to set the background of what we are studying, to set in the epistemology we're working with, the paradigm we are working with. The mind-body problem, that's the main, I think, a very important philosophical concept that has been around, at least in the West, well, since the times of Plato, but especially after Descartes, when he proposed that there is the mind as a thinking thing and the body as a material extended thing. Ironically, he used this word extended. So the mind is something ideal, so dating back to Plato's ideas, ideal, immaterial, immortal, eternal. Whereas the body is matter, just like everything else, and it decays. And until this day, this idea of mind and body is very present everywhere. We tend to say, like, the mind and the mind wants something, the body does another thing, or the mind as a software and the body as a hardware, all those metaphors. And that guided much of philosophical and even cognitive research during the last century. But there's an alternative approach that proposes that the mind is part of the body, like it's not inseparable thing. It's a materialistic approach. And I think this is what, this is necessarily more adequate to talk about cognition in plants and in other organisms.
So it seems to me like this distinction between mind and body is really like, ironically, really in our brains, like we all kind of have that in our view of the world. And what you are saying is that the mind might be a process rather than a thing, right? If I understood you correctly.
Exactly. So the mind is not a thing, as Descartes proposed, but a process, because it arises from this dynamic interaction of matter and energy, basically. So the brain, the body, the environment, everything interacting in a particular way, in a specific way, gives rise to what we call cognition, or more specifically, mind. So yeah, at the moment this process stops, we just die. So it's a very important process.
I see. And I guess that because this view of the mind being a thing, probably most people think that is located that for cognition, a brain and a central nervous systems are required. Is that the case or is not the case that cognition needs a brain?
Yeah, that's the predominant idea. That is changed nowadays, but especially in the 20th century, with the cognitivist revolution, they started to think as the mind as a computing process. So basically the brain would be a computer that has an input, a processing, and then it gives an output. But so for this work, then the mind would necessarily have to be in the brain, because the computation is using symbols to process information and giving outputs once you receive an input. But actually, the mind is not only in the brain, because the whole body influences the mind, and also the interaction with the environment.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, when we talk, when we think, we gesture, so we move our hands. When we try to remember something, we move our eyes. All those things, even the gut microbiota influences, which is not in the brain, definitely, but it influences how we perceive, influences our cognition. So the facial muscles, for example, when you move, when you smile, when you grin, they all change how we perceive emotions as well. So the whole body is involved in the cognition.
That's a really
Yeah.
sorry. That's a really easy way to understand when you mention about moving the eyes or moving the hands, right? Is obviously is not happening inside the brain or inside the head. And what do you mean when you and Michael say that the cognition is embodied, embedded, and enacted?
So after this, towards the end of the 20th century and beginning of this century, there is this new approach to cognition arising proposing that cognition is a process, so it's a post-cognitivist approach that proposes that cognition is a process of interacting with the environment, a dynamic exchange with the environment. And so they first proposed that since the whole body is involved, since we require a living body to have cognition, etc., cognition is embodied. It means that it needs a body, very simply, to happen. It is also embedded because the organism is embedded in an environment and in an inextricable communication or exchange with the environment. It's impossible to isolate an organism, anyone, from the environment. Anywhere you put an organism, they will be in an environment. And cognition is this exchange with the environment. It changes how we perceive the world, it changes our memories, and etc. So there's this recurrent pattern. So it's embedded. We are immersed in this environment. Then enacted. So basically, cognition, since it is a process, it only can express itself through actions in the world. So it's not a static thing, but it's active, in action, enacted. And lastly, extended, which is the most controversial topic. So it's called the 4E model of cognition. So embodied, extended, enacted. Extended is the last E that is the most controversial, because it proposes that not only cognition is in the body, but it can also extend outside the body, involving objects, organisms manipulate and interact with. And so this is a modern approach to cognition that I find more adequate, especially to study plants that evidently don't have brains, but they have a body, they interact with the environment, they have their own actions, and so on.
And in that sense, in cognition being extended, you wrote that plants are the nodes in the field of extended cognition. And this is similar when I think about multi-level selection, because it's a question that I am not completely sure how to answer regarding, for example, what is the limit of a group if we talk about group selection. In the same way, which is the limit of such field of cognition, or you also talk about units of cognition. So can you go a little deeper in that?
Yeah, that's the greatest question. Where are the limits of the cognitive process? Because indeed, it's hard to establish a clear boundary. I think it's more like a gradient of cognition that, so plants are the focal point because they're talking about plant cognition, but they interact with the mycorrhizas, they interact with bacteria, they release volatiles in the air. All of this, according to the theory we are proposing, with the hypothesis we are proposing, involves the plant cognition, but where exactly this stops, I'm not sure either. But yeah, I see plants more as this focal point where we have this density of cognitive activity, but that obviously has many ramifications.
And in the article, you also explain quite convincingly that, yeah, it's very difficult to tell apart plants from the environment. I find myself recently sampling a lot of roots, and yeah, I mean, especially in very dense forests, the in a soil core is almost all made out of roots. It's almost very little soil, actual soil, and it's entirely made out of roots. So, and they are, of course, they go in many different directions, and they, in 3 weeks, they are in a different place. So I really like that view, that is, especially for plants, maybe for other organisms is not the case, but especially for plants, um, is very difficult to tell them apart from the environment.
That's true.
Um, and also when you take into account the biotic environment, I mean the relationships with all the neighbors. And the thing that I find curious is that when we come from different areas of expertise, some people do what I could call multi-level selection. They can call it facilitation interactions, for example. And then it can be also a cognitive phenomena in some way. You in the article go over 5 implications of extended land cognition. I know that we don't have much time, but maybe can you tell us these 5 implications of extended plan cognition?
Yeah, so in the paper proposed some of implications that would imply accepting this hypothesis. The first one is that the traditional way of seeing cognition as a computation process within a brain, manipulations of symbols, so this representationalist approach is evidently not adequate to study the cognition of plants, especially because plants don't have brains, so we don't know if they have representations of the world. But there are other ways of understanding cognition. We observe cognitive behaviors in plants, so we need a different approach for them. The question about the minimal unit of cognition is the second implication. So like in the multi-level selections or the holobiont theory, I think everything is related. The unit is not the plant alone, but the plant plus its environment, the environment that the plant modifies with the soil microbiota, with the mycorrhizal fungi, everything that influence the plant and the plant can influence. So this is the unit. That is hard to define a border to this unit, but nevertheless, we see a unit. The third implication is that the process of cognizing, of exploring the world, of sensing, processing information in different ways, happens with the environment. So it's not the plant alone processing this interaction, but there's a recurrent interaction with the plant, with the environment, with the microorganisms, and so on. So yeah, this cognitive process spans much more than just the plant. It goes beyond its bark and epidermis. The fourth is that the network that processes information, if you can say, is not internal. So because, for example, in the case of volatiles, it's very clear that when they normally signal one, they normally bring information between two branches in the plant, so they signal to different branches. They form a network of information sharing and processing that is outside the body as well. So it's not inside. So this network is also external, not just internal, as we would expect for the brain, for example. And finally, we just mentioned some similarities that we could have with the plants is that normally animals have centralized units or centralized places to perceive the environment. So eyes for sight, the mouth for taste, nose for smell, and so on. But we have the sense of touch that spans the whole body. And that's very interesting because plants also have this sense of touch, and that's also in the whole body. And that could also be related to cognitive process, extended cognitive process, especially in animals, because we use the sense of touch so much. And I think those would be some of the implications of this hypothesis.
That's very interesting, especially regarding the touching sense. Would you think that, like, in an evolutionary view, like many billions of years ago, maybe touch was kind of the first cognitive mechanism from our ancestors, and then after they became specialized in different ways of living, other kind of senses or mechanisms develop?
I'm not sure which would be the first sense, because chemical reception
Okay.
that evolved later as smell or taste is also very important if you consider a very primordial environment. But I
Mhm.
think I think that cognition is a process that we can find in every living being. Actually, it's a condition for life itself. Once the first cell evolved, it was already cognitive with everything that it implies and the cognition that is possible to happen in a cell, of course, because it depends on the complexity of the sensory apparatus. So I
Yeah,
think it came more as a ready thing than just one thing after the other.
yeah. I think that you are referring to Maturana and Varela's ideas.
Yes,
Um,
yes. Yeah, Matteo and Varela very inspiring for me for this whole work.
yeah, I imagine so. I was lucky enough to have a class with him like 1 year before he passed away.
What? Wow,
Yeah,
that's amazing.
yes.
Yeah, I didn't have this fortune to meet him in person.
Well, sadly, it was during the pandemic, so it was like a Zoom call, but it counts. Um, before going through to the four kind of mechanisms or the four kind of evidence of extended plan cognition, maybe which is the more kind of short definition of extended plan cognition that you can think about it, which will be like the elevator pitch.
um, oh, I would just define as so the cognitive process of plants is not restricted to the plant body, but extends outside and involves elements of the environment that have an active role in this process. Um, yeah, I think
Uh,
that's
yeah, if
very
you,
simple.
yeah, no,
And
but
also, but it's very important to also distinguish cognition from mind or consciousness. So those are other things that I hope who are listening to us don't like mix them. So I'm talking about cognition, which is a more basal thing.
so what would be the difference then?
Well, mind is a concept very related to humans, to human consciousness, and I'm not sure if we can talk about consciousness in the case of plants. So I would leave those more, and also it's very hard to prove scientifically in consciousness. Like, so I would leave those concepts to the side for now and just focus on this interaction dynamic with the environment that allows you to survive, to adapt dynamically. That's cognition.
Okay,
And yeah.
great. And then you talk about kind of four mechanisms, which correct me if I am wrong, but if four mechanisms which are kind of evidence of extended plan cognition, which are root exudates, root microbiota or mycorrhizal fungi, and volatile organic compounds. So three happen below ground, and one of these mechanisms is above ground.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that at least for the people that usually listens to this YouTube channel, we don't need to go much deep into root exudates and microbiota and mycorrhizal fungi because I hope that you know why they are so important and what they mean, but maybe can you explain why they would constitute evidence of extended plan cognition?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so root acidates, because there's some papers showing that plants can use those acidates to perceive the environment around the roots and place the roots optimally depending on what they perceive through those acidates. So the buildup of acidates between the root and an obstacle allows the plant to perceive this obstacle before reaching it. So that's very interesting, a form of perception from a distance, but using the environment that is modified by the plant. Um, microbiota, especially bacteria. There are several studies showing that plants can actively modify the composition of the communities in the soil through the selective release of certain acids or acidates or that will shape the community. And apparently, when they shape this community, they change the soil in a way that kind of stores information from the past or from like previous stresses, which is a form of memory. So when the plant had a disease, for example, they changed the decomposition of the bacteria. And if they still grow in this conditioned soil, or even if another plant is planted in this conditioned soil, and this plant faces a disease again, it will be more resistant, just because the composition of the bacteria is below ground. And mycorrhizas are so interconnected to the plant that plants would use mycorrhizas to kind of forage for them, so delegating this foraging activity of finding nutrients, solving problems. They also help plants surviving in more extreme environments. They help, well, I don't think I need to explain what mycorrhizas do for plants, but problem solving is a very important characteristic of cognition. So cognition serves to allow organisms to adaptively and flexibly solve problems, and mycorrhizas help plants in this. And then finally, volatiles. That would be the only form of extended cognition above ground, where plants release those chemicals in the air and they convey information around the ground. So they shortcut physiological constraints in the plant. And those are the four main channels we proposed. But other channels are possible as well. I don't know. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, of course. I think that another important distinction now that you just mentioned communication both below ground and above ground would be that one, especially in fungi. I recently hear a lot about communication in fungi by electric signals and so on. And in plants, there is also plant communication, but what's conceptually the difference between plant communication and plant cognition?
So communication is pure and simply the exchange of information between two entities. So it can happen even in non-living systems like computers. They can exchange information. But communication is important for cognition because we need to exchange information either internally, like in the brain, like sharing information or senses, or even in the case of extended cognition. So basically, cognition is more than just communication, but communication is fundamental to cognition to exist.
Okay.
In fact, Pamela Lyon, a philosopher in Australia, proposes that there is a basic toolkit of cognition with several items, and one of them is communication, along with balance, decision-making, attention, and others. I hope it was clear. I don't know.
Yeah. At least for me, it was very clear. Yeah. So finally, reaching to the end of our conversation, and because previously it was mentioned that plants are so embedded, would be correct to say, in the environment, are so in the environment, which this kind of challenges like I would say a typical individualistic view of what a plant is. So incorporating this extended plant cognition framework, how would you define like plant? I know it's a very broad question, but
that's a very hard question, actually. Yes. So yeah, plants have this system, this amazing system that connects the heavens with Earth, basically, allowing the energy of the sun to enter our biosphere, converting energy, and they have this community of organisms around them that are so intrinsically connected to them that it's hard to tell them apart. So a plant could be just a plant alone, but actually they are always embedded in this environment. So maybe we should consider all this, all the organisms and the interactions.
Okay, many thanks. And finally, this always is the case in our interviews. We ask about like what is the future for you, both like professionally, but also with these ideas, what's the next step with these ideas specifically?
Well, I'm finishing my PhD, exploring this topic, and I hope to keep doing this research and um, finding empirical evidence for extended cognition, because now it is a hypothesis. We published those papers analyzing the literature, but with experiments that weren't designed to test specifically extended cognition, although I think they serve very well to the purpose. But it's important to have more data on this. So I hope to keep studying plant cognition and plant extended cognition also.
I think this is really a new field of study, and it's very inspiring that you are doing that from your PhD. So that's amazing, and congratulations on that. And I yeah, well, it's like um it's like Thomas Kuhn paradigm shift stuff, which I guess at the beginning can be difficult, but then hopefully the ideas become more cemented and more appreciated. And I'm sure that that will be the case with this, because I should say that this article that I talk about is very beautifully written. It's really easy to
Thank
read.
you.
So that also helps a lot in getting these ideas out there. And with that, many thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you for this interview and for this chat. And yeah, I hope whoever is listening to us find these ideas inspirational, and they can see plants as these amazing cognitive organisms in interaction with their mycorrhizals, with mycorrhizal fungi in their networks of interactions.